Okay, so good morning and welcome back. And today we'll be talking about the city of Portland, which was another one of the Union Pacific City Fleet trains. And this train connected Chicago to Portland over the Chicago and Northwestern and the Union Pacific, kind of like the city of Los Angeles did for LA, but it went to Portland instead. But like the city of Los Angeles, these trains were connected before the Depression when the city fleet started running. And today we'll be talking a little bit about that history. The connection to Oregon was first planned in 1878 and a railroad was chartered. The Oregon Railway and Navigation Company was its name. This company took over the assets of a shipping company and railway that was chartered to run to Walla Walla. This is a decade after the completion of a railway connection between Portland and California. Started construction. The ORN was going to connect to the Northern Pacific at Wallula, Washington, and Walla Walla, basically just right outside of it. This connection was finished in 1882, which put Portland on the map by connecting it to the National Rail Network. In 1881, the Union Pacific was looking to have its own connection to the Pacific Northwest. The Union Pacific wouldn't reach LA until 1903, just for the reference here. This is still the 1800s. The Union Pacific created the Oregon Short Line, which was a subsidiary chartered to build a railway between Granger, Wyoming, and Huntington Junction, Oregon, to connect with the OR&N. The UP rightly saw this as their only way to connect to the Pacific under their own flag, and in 1884, they connected to Huntington Junction, and the UP could, in theory, roll trains all the way to Portland. By this time, the OR&N was under the control of a man named Henry Villiard, who managed to take control of the railway from a man named J. Cook, who was involved with the Northern Pacific somehow. I probably will do a more detailed history on that because it's a bit confusing and frankly a little bit outside the scope of this video. But anyways, Villard wanted to control all the railway and steamship lines into Oregon, and he didn't have control of the Oregon and he did have control of the Oregon and California Railway at this point, which was the connection to the Southern Pacific, which went into California, and owned it until they bought it out. The OR&N, which I think was the OSN, the Oregon Steamship or Steam and Navigation Company, or whatever it was called, was owned in part by J. Cook in the Northern Pacific. After the financial panic in 1873, the Northern Pacific was forced to sell off its stock in the OSN because they had used them for collateral to secure debt to finance the Northern Pacific's construction. So in 1879, Villiard was in total control of the OSN and reformed it into the ORN, the Oregon Railway Navigation Company, and put it under the control of another holding company called the Oregon and Transcontinental, and made a deal with the Northern Pacific. Again, this gets kind of complicated because of how regulations work. These railways kind of had to have like a nesting doll of holding corporations holding various bits of the company together. So these railways kind of acted more like a conglomerate rather than as a one cohesive corporation, and in some ways railways still kind of act this way. The deal with the Northern Pacific was that they'd be allowed to use the OR&N's tracks to connect from Wallula to Portland, so long as the Northern Pacific agreed to not build a competing line along the northern bank of the Columbia River, which would become this later in 1908, I believe, would become the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway. The Northern Pacific agreed to this deal in October of 1880, but 1 month later it secured $10 million in financing to build its own line along the north bank of the Columbia River, so they basically just double-crossed him immediately. Villiard didn't want to lose his business, so he used his connections with German investors to secure $12 million for an unnamed venture. And he was so good with these investors at this point that they would go in blind for this project, and it ended up with Villiard having a controlling interest in the Northern Pacific for several years after this point, which subsequently ended up canceling what would become the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle at this point, because they had the connection at Walla Walla, Wallula, basically somewhere in Washington to connect into Portland. And then this brings us more into the history of the Union Pacific. This was built to essentially keep the UP out of Oregon and to keep all the traffic into Oregon controlled by Villiard or one of his companies. So in 1884, other events were afoot by this point. By late 1883, the OR&N's finances were overextended and the company was facing bankruptcy. And some of Villiard's creditors on the East Coast bailed out the company, but demanded he fall on his sword, so to speak, so he was pushed out. New people were in. I think it was the Oregon and Transcontinental at this point. I'm not really sure how the nesting doll of corporations really worked because, again, it was kind of a weird time in American history for regulations and doing business. So I'm not going to pretend to be like a perfect historian on that front. But anyways, the long and short of this is that the ORN was no longer safe from competition from either the Union Pacific or the Northern Pacific. The ORN's new owners figured the NP would send its traffic through Cascade Pass to Tacoma, and then, if they needed to, down to Kalama to float the freight and passengers into Oregon on the Columbia River. And as I mentioned, this is a good 20 years before the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle would be built, so there wasn't really a prospect of a line over the northern bank of the Columbia River, at least at this point. The other reason why shipping to Tacoma was such a threat was that the Northern Pacific's connection between Wallula and Tacoma never met their railway, so they'd obviously lose shipping, and shipping over Cascade Pass to Tacoma was an easier and cheaper shipping route than going to Portland and trying to ship stuff in and out. At the time, Tacoma was also a busy port, and it was frankly a better port, given that Puget Sound is a much better location, being inland, an inland bay more than just a navigable river. The Northern Pacific having its own connection to the Pacific would not only hurt the ORNN and possibly ruin it, but it could have ruined Portland as being a major city, and frankly, to put it bluntly, as the West was being settled, a lot of towns grew up and died all the time, and if it weren't for boosters attracting rail lines to places like Denver and the discovery of valuable minerals in the area, Cheyenne likely would have been the larger city in the Front Range today, but Denver probably would still be fairly large, but Cheyenne would probably be the more important of the two. But the mining booms and people getting the train line into Denver made it into a hub, which basically made it be the larger city, and it really, frankly, outgrew Cheyenne and became one of the largest. Actually, I think it is the largest city between Chicago and the West Coast. Even to this day, Portland is a much smaller urban area than the Seattle-Tacoma area. Some of that is due to the better geography of Puget Sound, and the other is the railroads building their connections to Seattle and Tacoma instead of just Portland. And Portland's first major rail connection to the outside world was completed in 1882 to the Northern Pacific in Wallula, the Union Pacific to Huntington Junction 2 years later in 1884, and the Southern Pacific in California in 1887. The next major connection to the outside world was in 1908 when the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle was finished to Portland. And the main termini for the Great Northern, the Milwaukee Road, and to a lesser extent, even the Union Pacific was in the Seattle-Tacoma area as time went on. Portland was the main terminus for the Southern Pacific and the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, and the SP more because it couldn't get further north than it was. But anyways, back to the hullabaloo over Villard and all that stuff. So the new owners figured the only way they could survive as a company is an attempt to lease the company's operations to either the Union Pacific or the Northern Pacific. At first, they attempted to negotiate with Northern Pacific, which went nowhere, and this obviously stressed out the leaders of the ORNN, and I believe it was also the Oregon and Transcontinental. Again, it's a nesting doll of corporations. In response, they started building extensions of their track into territory that was generally controlled by the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific, to which the Northern Pacific and Union Pacific did the same thing. And this all came to a head in 1887 when the management of the ORNN came to an agreement to lease the company's operations to the Union Pacific, which would include their shipping business along the Columbia and Snake Rivers. And the directors in Portland, which I believe are the Oregon and Transcontinental, again, gets kind of mucky with their history, and I'm sorry for not being perfectly understanding how all these nesting doll corporations worked. But anyways, the directors balked and vetoed the deal, so the UP kept building into from Walla Walla to Pendleton in Washington. And through all this commotion, Villiard came back into the picture in 1889, and he became the owner, or at least worked for, or was somehow affiliated with the Oregon and Transcontinental, and he then sold the ORNN to the Union Pacific outright. But because, again, nesting doll corporations, this is actually not where the story of this line ends. 4 years later was the Panic of 1893, and the Union Pacific declared bankruptcy, and the courts started doing what they do, at least at that time period, was reorganizing the company. And the first thing to note was what happened to the Oregon Short Line, which was the UP subsidiary that ran from Granger, Wyoming to Huntington Junction, and I think owned and or had the lease of the ORNN. That was terminated, so the UP lost it, and the ORNN. And the Union Pacific regained control of the Oregon Short Line and the ORNN in 1910 under Harriman. So again, only, a 17-year loss of the company. And at that point, these companies were further reorganized and became the Oregon Washington Railroad and Navigation Company, and from what I can tell, there is some conflicting evidence as to what happened to this company after that. According to one source, this railway leased its operations to the Union Pacific as a paper corporation until 1987, when it was officially absorbed into the UP during the mega merger era. Another source says the railway is effectively absorbed to the UP in 1936. And given that the UP ran trains all the way into Seattle under their own power and operations, I would wager that the Oregon-Washington Company was converted to what was a paper railroad in 1936 in a similar manner to how they basically ran their operations from Salt Lake City to Barstow. And as a quick refresher, a paper railroad was a company that was a wholly owned subsidiary of its parent company, with a board filled with employees from the parent company, and it would lease the operations of the subsidiary to the parent company. And this was done because of how railroads were regulated before deregulation in the 1980s. Railroads weren't allowed to be as big as they are now, or at least without having a billion different corporations owned by a billion different subsidiaries. And also they were generally chartered by a state or the federal government. Bigger railroads such as or, rich locals like Villard would effectively buy up these companies and cobble them together into a coherent system. Sometimes these companies would remain quote-unquote separate, so they could charge interchange fees and make more money, or they'd be treated like extensions of the main company. This was generally allowed because ICC and state regulators were more concerned with the Class 1 of the days getting too big and merging more than they were with a handful of smaller companies getting gobbled up by the large robber barons. Sometimes these were one-state railroads, and state regulators were usually bought off by the one to three large railroads within a state. So if it was within a state, usually the state government didn't care as much because, frankly, corruption. Like the Southern Pacific, at least in California, was very notorious for basically owning the state government until like the 50s. As far as passenger trains that ran before the city of Portland, I'm kind of unsure about their history since not a lot was really recorded about them. I know that there was a train called the Portland Limited, which ran during the heavyweight era, and this train was renamed the Portland Rose in 1930. And like every other soon-to-be secondary train on the UP, it got streamlined equipment as its first-class counterparts were upgraded. Originally, the Portland Rose traveled from Portland east to Omaha, where it then split with a section going over the Chicago and Northwestern to Chicago, and another segment going over the Wabash Railroad to St. Louis. As time went on, the Portland Rose was truncated to Kansas City and then Denver, and then eliminated when Amtrak was formed in 1970. The Portland Rose was the secondary train along the route to the Pacific Northwest. It was the Los Angeles Limited and the San Francisco Overland of its route, compared to the city of Portland, which was the first-class train of the route. And from what I understand, the Portland route didn't really have an equivalent of the Challenger. Basically, the Portland Rose was that. And the city of Portland was the first-class train along the route between Chicago and Portland over the Union Pacific. The city of Portland was one of the first city fleet trains, and if I read that correctly and wrote this down in my notes correctly, it was the second city fleet train, the city of Salina being the first. And the original city of Portland ran with one of the articulated train sets that ran on the other city trains, or at least the early ones. And the quick success of the city of Portland is what convinced the Union Pacific to expand the city fleet. These early city trains had brand new plus features like the enclosed rooms, which was still fairly new during the Depression, better dining cars, lounges, and so on. The success is actually what convinced the UP to heavily invest in new equipment even during the height of the Depression. This is also what helped spawn the creation of the Chiefs and other streamlined trains across the western United States. Seeing the success of the first new streamliners led to more, which frankly would be true today. Hint, hint, nod, nod, Amtrak. So the city of Portland may not be as lauded as the Empire Builder or the North Coast Limited, the famous trains to the Pacific Northwest, but it was the first to offer modern sleeping accommodations and the round-end observation cars. This route was less scenic than the other routes to the Pacific Northwest, mostly the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, but it was as luxurious, if not more so, than the competition. Also, it must be noted that the UP valued the city of Portland as much as its sister, the city of Los Angeles, and more so than the city of San Francisco, which was carried by the SP between Ogden and Oakland. That being said, the city of Portland was re-equipped at the same time as the city of Los Angeles, and the city of San Francisco was upgraded after the other two were, which just kind of shows that the city of Portland was valued much higher than the city of San Francisco. At its height, the train carried 13 cars on average, which included 4 sleepers, a dome diner, a dome coach, a dome lounge, and a cafe lounge, along with your baggage and mail cars. To maximize the viewing of the good scenery and ignore the worst, the train was scheduled to leave Chicago at 5 p.m., so the prairie portion of the route would be covered at night. The Chicago and Northwestern handled the train to Omaha, Nebraska, and they exchanged it with the Union Pacific at 1 a.m. in the morning. Most passengers would be waking up by the time the train made it to Cheyenne. Passengers would get to enjoy the mountain views of Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. And passengers would go to bed somewhere in Idaho and wake up as they were approaching Portland the next morning. And then there were through cars that would be sent on the pool train to Seattle, so there would be that connection to Seattle, so it wasn't just a Portland train. As mentioned before, the Portland Rose and the city of Portland weren't maintained when Amtrak took over in 1971. In 1977, Amtrak added the all-coach Pioneer between Seattle and Ogden, and this was done at first with the then new Amfleet cars. In 1982, a through coach was added to the train so that it ran with the San Francisco Zephyr to Chicago. A few months later, in 1983, a through sleeper was also added, and after the train was routed, or the California Zephyr was routed through the Moffett Tunnel route in 1983, the Pioneer was extended south to Seattle to Salt Lake City, but there were problems with this train. The train was too long and too heavy to run the Moffett Tunnel route, and the new California Zephyr was actually 16 cars long with superliner cars, and it needed 4 F40PH locomotives to pull the train over the Rockies. So the solution was eventually to reroute the train again over the old over the overland route to Cheyenne and then turn south down the Front Range to Denver, where it would reconvene with the rest of the Zephyr and run to Chicago. This setup to Denver ran until the end of the Pioneer itself. The train ran until 1997 when the funding to keep it running ran out, and the states along their line did not come up with the funding to keep the train going. Oregon seems to be the state that gets blamed most for this, because the funding apparently hinged on them and they couldn't muster the votes in the legislature to pass it. And since then, there have been pushes from activists in Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado to revive the route, but so far nothing but studies have been pushed and some random websites coming out, and a lot of the stuff basically getting shoved into cabinets in the basement of various, I guess, archives. And the other main thing to note of this route along the city of Portland was that the Milwaukee Road actually did offer a basically tour package route plan to basically take the Milwaukee Road from Chicago to Seattle, Tacoma, and then take the Union Pacific back, or to take the Union Pacific to Seattle, Tacoma, and then the Milwaukee Road back as part of a tour package, which we will actually be talking about in the next episode, assuming, I've only done it twice where I've said I was going to make something and then slotted something in between. So yeah, the next one is going to be on the Milwaukee Road in the Olympian Hiawatha, and their connection between Chicago and the Pacific Northwest, which actually was one railway the entire way. So stay tuned for that one, and I will see you in the next one. Oh, and also I'd like to, before I totally piss off, is the thank you for those who have been subscribing. I know there's been a lot of subscribers that have come in, and since I'm recording this on March 18th, I know I only have 19 subscribers at this point. I would just like to thank those of you for subscribing. I think the last time I acknowledged this, or at least counted my subs, I was only at 5, so 19 may not be a huge number, but at least for me, I've gone from 5 to 19, so that's good to me. And I have been trying to make a better effort at talking slower, because apparently a few people have complained about that, so I'm trying to improve. And I know since I record these couple months and ahead of time, sometimes I don't always get to take any criticism in the comments into account for a few videos, so sorry about that, but trying to improve. But we'll see where things go. And just thank you for listening. And now hopefully this is where I actually sign off.